Welcome to the Zealous Podcast. I'm your host, Rocky Snyder. This week I've got Patrick Ward with me. He is in charge of R&D, that's research and development, for the Seattle Seahawks. We're going to dive deep into data collection, how to sift through all the information to create a championship season. So hope you enjoy the show, and we'll just get underway right now. Well, Patrick, thanks for coming on, Zealous. I really appreciate it. I know that this time of the year, right after the Super Bowl, everything's just underway for the next season, and things are at a breakneck pace. So appreciate you taking the time out. I'm just curious first, how did you get with the Seahawks? How did you land the position that you're in?
Yeah, it was sort of by luck at the time. So I just wrapped up my 9th season, going into my 10th. My 10th off season. And at the time, 10 years ago, a decade ago, I was working at Nike in the sports research lab. And just with a group of us, there was like 5 researchers that were doing applied research. So there's lots of different projects at Nike, footwear research, obviously, wearables, clothing, things like that. And we were doing more like applied research, elite athlete type of stuff in the field. And Nike, at that time, Nike had just partnered or became the main sponsor for the women's soccer league, the National Women's Soccer League. And they were like, what can we do around this? And so I was like, well, why don't we come up with like a test battery and go around to all the teams, all the women's teams in training camp, and measure them on jumps and sprints and things like that. And so I did it. We bought a bunch of OptiJump skis, which are like a light sensor for jumping and things like that. They're pretty easy and portable LED lights. And we got that stuff, and they sent me on the road. So I did a whole summer on the road, and I went to every women's professional soccer team in the United States at their training camps. And I tested all the women. At that time, we had the largest data set on elite women's soccer physiology. It was pretty cool.
How long did that take? Your travel, where you just have your pickup truck or something with your gear in the back, and you're going to see one elite team to another?
So, yeah, kind of. Well, so 4 of us would go, and we'd fly out from Portland, where Nike's headquarters are. We'd fly out from Portland into an area. Like, let's say we were doing the East Coast, and that might be like a week long or a 10-day road trip. So we might fly into Boston. We'd do the New England team. Then we'd drive down and we'd hit like 2 New York teams, drive over to Jersey, hit a team, and then drive over, down to Philly, DC, and then we're out. So we just like stage it, and then we'd go back to Portland for a couple days, and then we might fly out and hit the Midwest and do a drive. And then, so yeah, it was it took the whole summer. But it was really cool. And we collected some cool data. And the way that I got up to Seattle, though, was the performance director at the time. They were just starting to kind of get into wearables and GPS and accelerometers, and they had heard about some of the work that we were doing. So they just kind of said, hey, does the test battery work for football players? And I was like, yeah, it's agnostic to gender or sport. So we came up and we did the test battery for their players in one of the off-season periods. And I did a bunch of analysis for them. I presented it back. They were like, wow, this is really interesting. Do you know anything about GPS? And I had done a bunch of GPS and accelerometer stuff. So I was like, yeah. And so they're like, well, we're just getting into that. And they kind of just poached me. And so from there, I ended up coming to Seattle as basically a dedicated sports science analyst. So just doing applied physiology, like trying to build a database of accelerometer data through practices and model training, building an injury database and all of those kinds of things. And I just kind of kept sort of progressing from there. In the first off season, I did a bunch of analysis around combine data, which is actually taking place right now, and draft prospects. And then that kind of turned into, can we do more modeling about draft prospects? And slowly that became, morphed into this, director of research and analysis role, where, I hope to kind of oversee whatever our research strategies are across football operations. So that's everything from the applied physiology, sports science, measurement type of stuff to scouting and player acquisition, draft and free agency and trades, and to even to the coaching side in terms of like preparation for the opponent during in season. We have some guys that work specifically on that, and then each of us contribute a little piece to the opponent preparation. So yeah, we work across all the football operations.
Wow. Obviously you geek out at stats, numbers, R&D stuff. That's your wheelhouse. When you get to Seattle years ago there, or over the course of this time, were there things that you found that were just a waste of time? Like you were looking into things and you're like, that's not going to serve any purpose. Or better yet, were there things that surprised you where you're like, I had no idea we could glean so much data from this? This is the golden nugget.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd be hard pressed to say that we ever found a golden nugget in anything. I think these things are really complicated. The interactions between all of the things we observe in the natural world are challenging to find any of those kind of golden nuggets, that the sort of needle in the haystack. I'd say in terms of like things that are not fruitful, I mean, measurement is something that's really important to me, like how we measure things, whether it's valid, whether it's reliable, whether it's responsive to change over time, because that's really what we're dealing with is humans basically changing across a season. You're never the same person that you were yesterday. Your cells change, all these things change. So, evaluating measurement and trying to understand the ways in which people change over time and whether the measurements that we're taking can tell us something about how you as an individual are changing. And, it's a little bit of a kind of thought process around like personalized medicine. So I've read a lot and spent a lot of time in studying things like N of 1 and single subject research design. Because in my head, and practitioners say this all the time, and they say, oh, research cares about is, population-based statistics. And that's true. That's what would be called like nomothetic research, right? So we go out into the population, we grab a random sample, we hope that random sample represents that population, and we do a study and we say, on average, we expect people similar to Rocky to behave like this when we do this training intervention.
Sure.
And that's great, except for the fact that Rocky is also different than those people in some unique way. Idiographic research or single subject research is more about how do we understand Rocky as the human within this population. And so a lot of the analysis that we've done, I guess, is more geared towards finding ways of understanding individuals. We wrote a paper about this in like 2017 called Putting the Eye Back in Team. And I have a few other papers that have just been submitted to publication that are on a similar topic. So I would say of all the things, not so much thinking about like the golden nugget, the thing that solves all other things, the one ring to rule them all type of concept. It's more like, how do I just get down to evaluating you as a person and then making a good decision with all of the information that we have about what to do with you next week in preparation for the next game.
How time consuming is that if you're dealing with single subjects compared to some type of group? I mean, obviously you probably have the means by which to do it, but in terms of actual like workload to you, what is that like?
I think, with everything, there's always a discovery period. You're trying to figure out what's one is having a good research question always is the most important thing. If I don't have a good question and I'm just looking at data in hopes to find something, I usually will be wasting a ton of time. So making sure I have a good research question really gets me on the right foot to tee off the ways in which I can start to think about how to conduct my analysis or structure my data. Once I get to that point, it's probably not as long a process as you think, as long as the methods are sound. If you're talking about analyzing individuals, a lot of this comes down to computing power. Like if I can write loops on my computer, I can loop through data pretty quickly and calculate these things. I mean, rarely do we have computing power issues unless we're dealing with like the most granular of granular, like wearable data, like where we're sampling at 100 hertz and it's thousands upon thousands of rows. Then we have, time constraints that are going to limit us. But for the most part, through the power of computers, we can do a lot pretty quickly, actually, as long as we have a good research question and we wrap our head around the methods that we want to apply.
Can you give me an example of what a good research question might be, and also one that is not a good question?
Well, I mean, I guess not a good question would be, so let's think about like force plates, right?
Sure.
So a not good research question would be, we're going to test the guys, once a week, and we're going to try and figure out if it means anything this year. Well, what does that mean? We're going to test them once a week. When are we going to test them? During the week? How are we going to tease out what matters? What variables from that force plate should we think about in terms of understanding what should matter? A force plate readout can have, 200 plus variables. Like, what of those, how are we going to determine what matters? It's too vague, right? A more specific question, and this is really what I try and do, is whenever people around football operations have a question, I try and pepper them. So it's like a Socratic question is you question the question. I try and pepper them because a lot of times people don't, they have in their head an idea of what it is they want to understand, but they don't necessarily know how to articulate it. So if I can kind of get them talking a bit more, I can distill down a little bit more detail about what it is they want to know about. So in that example, a more refined question would be like, okay, well, why do we want to collect force plate data weekly? Well, I think from what I've heard, like we could see if, neuromuscular changes take place and people are like losing, power across the season as they get fatigued. Okay, great. So what is a variable? Well, a good variable from the literature, if we go back and we search the literature, seems to be like measuring impulse. So force under the force time curve. Okay, great. Let's start with that. When should we test them? Well, if we play games on Sunday, should we test them immediately on Monday? Should we test them or should we test them on Wednesday, like the first day back to actual training, 48 hours from the game? Maybe guys don't want to jump on a Monday if we're doing jumps. Okay, so let's do Wednesday. And then let's make sure we do hands on hips. So that'll increase our reliability. So now the first thing is, one, let's get a baseline and figure out where people are. Two, after every game on a Wednesday, we test them in the same way, hands on hips, the same type of jumps. Okay, next, we want to understand how much variance is there from week to week for individuals going through a season. And that might start to tell us about, okay, well, how much variability is normal within this population? How much outside of that kind of variability should we maybe see in order to feel like, wow, this person is probably responding in an abnormal manner or something that we need to question? Follow-up questions might then be if we can measure impulse, if we can see that a change is occurring, if we adjust practice that week, can we maybe see if a change in the positive direction has happened? Is it responsive? Or how does the impulse then relate to what they did the previous week or in the game? So how much training took place the previous week? How much activity in the game? Maybe it was a really intense game. Maybe they did more running than usual. Maybe they took more hits than usual. Does that impact their impulse in a specific way? So trying to tease out what aspects of the training or game week are responsive, are impulse responsive to, and then which of those can we potentially intervene in and make a positive impact? Interesting.
What about the intangibles? Because all of you just mentioned are mainly tangible, measurable outcomes or elements. But what about the emotional aspect? What about the desire, the drive? Do you delve into that with your R&D? And if so, how do you do that?
The drive, like you mean for the player?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really interesting topic. There's a great book written by a guy named Douglas Hubbard called How to Measure Anything. And he's sort of a consultant to the government, to the military on these types of problems. In the whole book, it goes through like the structure of how you put in place systems to measure what people would normally say the immeasurable, the intangibles. We can't put a number to them. And he talks about how to do this and how to teach people within the organization, like let's say managers, to teach them how to be calibrated to scoring their employees and saying like, oh, this person has the qualities to succeed in an advanced role or something like that. So we steal a lot from that book. The three kind of axioms that he goes off of are, what is it you're trying to measure? Why is it important? And then tell me what it looks like when you see it, right? So an intangible like drive is like, well, what is it? It's probably something to do with like the player's eagerness to be a better player. And why is it important? Well, we want guys that are hungry, and we want them to be, striving to be their best so that we can be our best. And then what does it look like when you see it? It's like, man, like this guy's always stays after to do extra work in terms of like studying. He always is in the training room every morning, even when he's not hurt, to get extra treatment and focused on that stuff. He always meets with the nutritionist once a week to get his diet in. And so really quickly, once we start saying that, we're like, well, man, like we can grade these guys on those types of things. And uniquely, everybody around the building kind of has has like a different interaction with each player. And so one of the things that I sometimes will do is I'll have the entire performance staff, like strength coaches and medical staff, actually grade the players on things like this independently, because like how you see a player might be different based on your interactions. Maybe he's really open with you, but not with me. So I might grade him differently. And so if everybody grades the players based on their own unique interactions, we can pool that information and build like a composite distribution that says like, oh, we think this is a pretty focused and driven player. Maybe he hasn't not a great interaction with 2 out of the 8 staff members, but the other 6 grade him really highly. We're pretty confident that this player is a focused player, and so we start to do some things like that.
Very cool. That's so things that you would think are immeasurable can actually be measured. That's very fascinating. Okay, so you're gearing up for the combine, and you were just mentioning that there's certain things that when you look at them, can they be reproduced? Do they change over time? Are they malleable and so on? What are your thoughts with the combine? I mean, it's been going on for decades now, and we still have the same measurements over time. Do they maintain a very strong validity? Is there immense deviations from it? Or do you use the combine to the degree that you want, or would you prefer other things along with that?
So the combine is, like you said, it's a pretty time-honored test. I think maybe in like 1984 it started, or so. I can't remember the exact date.
Around there.
And yeah, exactly. And it's a great idea, right? In theory, what we're doing is we're saying, man, we really want to know how athletic these players are and be able to rank and compare them to each other. That's like the fundamentals of any sport, all the way back to the Olympics. It's like, how do you compare to everybody else? And so in doing so, the founding fathers of the combine kind of came up with these proxy measures that they thought would be good. Like if a guy runs a fast 40, and why was it a 40? Well, I think it was Bear Bryant that was like, on special teams plays, guys generally run about 40 yards downfield. So that's why it was a 40 and not a 10 or a 20. They came up with these proxy measures, and they said, well, this kind of tells us about speed, and this kind of tells us about change of direction, the short shuttle and the 3-cone drill. And this kind of tells us about lower extremity power, the vertical jump and the broad jump, in a vertical plane and a horizontal plane. And this tells us about upper extremity. I'll use the term strength. It's more like strength endurance, like the bench press, right? And so they did these things, and they continue to do these things. And it's a huge battery or a huge data bank of players from decades that have now collected data. The problem is that since about 1997, there's been probably like 13 or 14 research studies on the combine and whether it predicts future success. And as you could imagine, it's pretty noisy because success is predicated on a lot of different things. For example, some of the intangibles that you mentioned. And there's guys who aren't as athletic, but are driven to just be better than the more athletic guy. And sometimes they succeed for other reasons. So it's pretty noisy and it's not as direct as you'd like it to be. I think what to me is most interesting is as we get into now this era of being able to quantify the game, like, college data, you can buy computer vision data that gives you the coordinate space-time models of the players on the field. So, speeds and accelerations and changes of direction. And we get the same at the NFL level. And so now in my head, I'm like, well, I don't really need the proxy measure anymore because I can see directly how this guy does the thing. It's like on the field of play, the athletic trainer runs out and does the drawer test to see if he thinks that your ACL is torn. That's the proxy measure. And if it's super loose, he's like, whoa, get the stretcher, get the gurney, let's get him to in the back and do some extra diagnostics. The only reason he does that proxy measure is because he can't run out there with the MRI machine and directly see if your ACL is torn, right? And that's kind of like where I feel like we're at. Like we have all this wearable data now where it's like, well, we have the MRI. We don't need to do the drawer test. We can directly see what the guy does in certain situations and remove some of the context or add back in some of the context. And so I think it's moving in that direction. But there's a lot of tradition in the combine and it's a huge data set. So I don't know that it will change a ton unless maybe people push for change. But it's a great set of proxy measures. It's a really cool event to see guys that are not just athletic, but like massive humans do like incredibly athletic things. So yeah.
And just curious, what was your path of concentration in studies when you were going to school? Did you finish out as an econ major or what was it?
No, actually, exercise science, and then my PhD was in sport and exercise science, and it was specifically around the use of inertial sensors to quantify practice demands within American football. So we went through and did some initial validation work on like whether these things can differentiate between various movements that players perform on the field, and then whether we can use those to differentiate between how position groups ergonomically perform within practice. And then if we could do that, could we then model training across a season? Could it tell us something about the impact on player health and injury? And all the while, this sort of backdrop of teasing out the individual differences. So how do we also look at, Rocky as one person within the broader wide receiver group, for example?
What did you find out? I'm fascinated by that.
Yeah. So, the accelerometers are crude measures of activity. They're probably not as direct as we'd want them to be, but they're the best that we have right now. Part of the problem is that they are worn on the torso. And so we know that if we wear something on the torso, it's further away from the lower limbs, which are striking the ground. So some of the forces that we're measuring aren't direct forces of lower extremity activity. You could think of it like if I take an accelerometer and put it in the middle of your back between your two scapula, I'm really measuring whole body shaking upness. I'm not really measuring like lower extremity load. I'm measuring how much your upper body or your total body really shakes up. And that's when you sprint and jump and change direction, get hit. The other thing that we found, which is of no surprise to anybody who watches the game, is, different position groups have different ergonomic demands, and GPS measures are useful for guys that play in position groups that run, like the outside, the cornerbacks and the cornerbacks and the wide receivers, maybe the tight ends, especially now in a more modern game. as you move inside, obviously the offensive and defensive linemen, there's just less running. Like if you have a GPS on those guys, you're like, oh, they ran, 1,500 yards this game. Like, who cares? It doesn't really tell me anything. But the accelerometer, the inertial sensors are useful because those actually telling us about how much the torso is getting shaken up is really important, because you're an offensive lineman. Your entire job is to basically absorb the blow from this 275-pound guy who starts 3 yards in front of you and just tees off on you, and you're going to get stuck backwards. And so quantifying that is actually a really valuable thing in terms of talking about the types of demands that the players go through during practice. And then you try and think about, like, well, how would you train for that or prepare for that? The kind of collision load. There's been some research on that in 2004 and 2006 on just this idea that players going through practices will take on collisions. And it's very similar to, like, if you've ever looked at like the old TIE fighters kicking the bamboo sticks to harden their bones. So there's this kind of like a contact adaptation that occurs where the body kind of gets hardened to these hits, and that increases inflammatory markers, CK, myoglobin. And what's interesting is that after several weeks, maybe 2 weeks of a training camp of hitting, what they found is that for the players that play in the games throughout the season in these studies, their set point just changes. It just never goes back down, because the body's like, if you're going to, once a week, you're going to be taking this kind of blows, we may as well just keep this higher level of inflammatory markers in the blood so that we're always ready. Because inflammation, we tend to think of it as a bad thing. It's actually the start of the healing process. It's only bad when it gets out of control. So if we increase the set point and don't let it get out of control, we'll be okay. And what you see is, like, guys who don't get that contact adaptation, maybe they're like returning back from an injury or surgery through training camp. They haven't had a lot of hitting. Their first game, they tend to come out with like tons of contusions on their leg, and they're black and blue, and they're really sore because their body hasn't been hardened to it. They haven't been kicking the bamboo shoot,
Wow. Very cool. Never thought of it like that. Okay. So one position, you're speaking positionally, one position that has seen an amazing increase in efficacy, in performance, is the field goal kicker. And I'm wondering, because, back in the 80s, even 90s, average field goal kicks were under 50 yards. They're probably 40 somethings to 30 something. You're almost guaranteed to make it. Now we've got beyond 50 yards. We've got 60, I think 63. I forget what the record is, but it just recently was done. How much is R&D? How much is R&D coming into play when we're talking about the extreme improvements of field goal kicking?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the same across all sports. Baseball is the same way. Guys can hit farther and harder exit velocities and things like that as they've changed their swing to loop up and get more range on the ball versus trying to just make contact like previous decades might have done. And the same is for kickers. These guys now, compared to the guys 20 or 30 years ago, have their own private coaches that are looking at biomechanics, using things like that they might use in baseball, like TrackMan data. A lot of these kickers have their own TrackMan software that their coaches provide them, which measures things like ball spin, exit velocity from the ground, from where the guy's holding, from where the usually the punter or the backup quarterback is holding the ball, the angle, like all of those things. And so, just like baseball players, just like golfers, they're really starting to like think about and train to shape their shot. Like, okay, if I'm going to kick from 50 yards, how do I have to strike this ball? What's the best way to do it? And also, like, that changes with the wind and the elements. And so as data has become more accessible to these guys and to their coaches, and some of the wearable tech or the camera-based systems have become more accessible to these coaches, it's really improved the quality of the kicker's performance compared to previous years, where they would just kind of line up and even just toe kick the ball. They didn't even, now guys strike a little bit more like a soccer player on the instep. But yeah, so it's just like as information grows, the people that are a little bit more savvy learn to use that information to their advantage, and they start to get some benefits from it.
Do you ever feel like you're drowning in data?
Yeah, we have a lot, and my thing is always, again, but kind of back to the start of our conversation is, having a good research question is always the most important thing. My PhD supervisor, Professor Barry Druss, used to always say, like, just because we can measure everything doesn't mean we should. And the more things that we measure and the more things that we look at, the easier it is to find random correlations and random observations and random things that might lead us astray. So we really have to sit down and think of our question and think of the framework behind that question. Because once we conduct the analysis, that framework helps us begin to go down the road of exposing why we think 2 or 3 or 4 or 10 things are related and what we can potentially do about it.
Have you ever found yourself asking, I won't say the wrong question, but not the most precise? And then you have to go, wait a minute, this is not going in the direction I want. Let's really backstep and reword this, because it's not giving me the outcome that I'm looking for. Not that you have an expectation of an outcome. I'm just meaning that the direction that you're hoping to understand is being diverted elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just like anything in life. Like, you'll fail a bunch of times before you find something that's useful, or you ask a question in a reason, in a different way, or think about things differently. I mean, in research, this has actually been done. They take a large data set and they have a question. And I think there's been like 2 or 3 studies on this now. They'll give the question and the data set to like 20 different university research groups, some of the best in the field. And they'll say, this is the data, this is the question we're trying to answer. And what they get returned is 20 different answers, because the ways in which that group may have looked at the data, the assumptions that they made, the feature engineering and data quality control approaches that they used, and the assumptions behind those, and the types of models that they use, they're all different. They all have different ways of looking at it. So, there's times where, you're going to fail. You're going to have things come out as be like, this doesn't really work. We have a new analyst here that we just hired, and she'll be like, I built this model and it's not very good. I'm like, well, let's just talk through it. Maybe we can figure out something else, but don't feel bad. I have like 300 models over the past 10 years on my desktop that are not very good. So, we always do things to, there's always different ways of learning. And that's part of the updating process. Someone asked me yesterday, like, how often do you guys update the models? I'm like, every year, because we might get new data. We might get new questions or new ways of looking at the data, new ways of looking at the same data, or different methods or analytic strategies or modeling strategies that maybe we weren't as savvy in before. And so, yeah, you try and sit down and really think about those things, and just know that not every project is going to be this amazing success, and you just kind of like accept that.
Is this the time of year that you do that, where you look over last year's models and start to tweak it here and there? And when is the busiest time for the guy that's in charge of research and development for the Seattle Seahawks? What's your busiest time of year?
Probably right now, just because there's a lot on. During the season, football is very seasonal. So during training camp, everything is much more focused around more the sports science side of things, because you're preparing. You got 5 weeks to get ready. So what are we going to do? How do we structure things? Once you get to the season, everybody is so nose down on week to week preparation. And us doing the opponent advance, we're always 1 week ahead. So if we're playing the Cardinals this week, we're already doing the analysis on next week's game against, the Saints, for example. So sometimes I'll go to our game on Sunday and I'll be like, oh, who are we playing? I don't even remember what it was about these guys, because it was 2 weeks ago that I even looked at them.
Uh-huh.
So you get into that during the season, and it's very focused on the week to week. And then the sports science element is how do we prepare the players this week for next week, and those kinds of things. But the busiest time is right now, because you basically have, you finish the season and you start with the, getting ready for free agency, and okay, but who's going to be out there and blah, blah, blah. And then you're thinking about, okay, we got to get first round of draft meetings before we go to the combine, and how to, get all the data structured and get the web apps built so that players can query, people can query players and that stuff. Then everybody goes to the combines and the pro days. That's going on this month. And while that's going on, we're refining all the models. New data's coming in as they measure all these players across the combines and pro days, building those into the models, making our forecast. Second round, free agency is going to open this month, and you're doing that. Then the second round of draft meetings, and then the draft. And then it's OTAs, it's off-season training. And that's a pretty, that time for me is really kind of organizationally building up the stuff that I'm going to need for the upcoming training camp in July. So what will the strength staff need? What will the medical staff need? Building dashboards, building other analyses. Is there new data that they want to collect? How are we going to put a system around collecting it? Make sure that it gets put into the database properly so that it can be, combined with other data sources and analyzed and stuff like that. But this is the most, this period of time is the kind of craziest.
Wow. And what kind of role do you play actually on game day?
No, I have no game day commitment. I go to the game, and just like our scouts, we all sit up in the team suite and we watch the game. I don't really, unless there's something I have to do, I really don't travel to away games either. Just because, we don't have a team suite on away games, and standing on the sideline. I used to stand on the sideline, and I quickly realized you're just, there's coaches coaching, there's players, shuffling around playing, and there's medical people watching and trying to do their job. And if you don't have a role, you're just in the way. And not to mention that when these guys come flying out of bounds, you're also always potential for death. So I felt like, watching it in the suite is kind of nice. And so I'm out of the way. Game day, just purely watching and taking it in, making notes, thinking about what kind of things we'd have to look at for next week, watching for injuries, because obviously that's going to play into when we come in on Monday, our meeting in terms of how we're going to manage the week and which players might be out or might not be out. So, keeping notes on that stuff as the game is playing out.
Okay. One last question here, because I appreciate the time you've already given me, but I don't want to take much more, but how about this? For the listening audience, we've got the majority of listeners are in their mid 20s to 30s. They are interested in a role or position within an organization like yours. What's the best way for those that are into the R&D aspects, sports science, and so on? How do they get a foothold into an organization like yours?
Yeah, this question I get a ton from students whenever they reach out and they want to have a phone chat. And my reply is always the same, and it's Twitter. And it sounds weird, but for most of us, myself and colleagues and friends that I have in the mid 2000s, when we were kind of getting into this, unless you went and you did your internship with a sports team and with a strength coach and they put you somewhere, you couldn't, it was tough to get in. And, some of us were like, I don't really want to be a strength coach. I'm more of a researcher. I'm more of a scientist, right? Twitter was the best way to connect to people for free and be a part of the conversation. So initially I had started a blog, and all I did was review research on like wearables and talk about like, well, this is what this research means. This is how we can apply it. And that's actually what got me introduced via the power of the internet to people that got me to the job at Nike, which then got me to the job here. So I always tell young students, like, go on to Twitter, open up an account, and start following people in like football analytics, hockey analytics, basketball analytics, baseball analytics. I have lists on Twitter for all of those things, and I just check them. People with teams are always on there. The second thing is learn a little bit of a coding language, R or Python, and get a GitHub page. Also, GitHub is free. It's a place for you to store any of your scripted languages, analyses, and start doing simple projects, even if it's just like basic data visualization, and throw it up on Twitter. Follow all these people and start to have conversations with them. If you have everything linked to a GitHub page, when they search it, they'll see that you're proficient in these coding languages. And when there's jobs open, if you've formed a relationship with them on Twitter, you have a great opportunity, a great in, and you already have projects in hand. Every time you go on one of these job interviews, they're going to do one of two things. They're either going to say, submit some code and a project so we can see if you're competent in doing this. And they're going to evaluate your code and your methods and all that stuff. Or they're going to just give you a data set and say, here's some data. You got 48 hours. Let us know what you find. And the more reps you get at doing this stuff yourself, the quicker you're going to be at turning it around and doing these types of things, having these conversations, being able to explain and walk people through a framework, being able to explain the end-to-end process from research question through to sharing data with end users and decision makers. So Twitter, GitHub, totally free, nothing but some elbow grease and some time. And data is like super abundant on the web. Profootballreference.com, sportsreference.com, baseballreference.com, hockeyreference.com, soccerreference.com, Laman baseball database, retro sheets, NWSLR, softball R. I mean, those are like 8 data sets that I could think of off the top of my head that are totally free. So you can get data and just begin to share, and it costs you nothing. And the best thing that comes out of it is that, and that's the thing, like people will think you're crazy. When I did this in 2006, friends would be like, well, you're crazy. You're not getting paid. Like you're just doing these blogs. You do one a week and you're not getting paid. But I just kept with it. And eventually somebody called and it turned into a totally new opportunity for me. So I still maintain my blog and it's all on stats and code and model building and things like that. And I also have a free screencast that we post every Sunday with a colleague of mine who's a statistical programmer in big pharma. And we give this stuff out for free and we put it out there. One, it helps me stay engaged with all kinds of people in different communities. And two, it's just been great to share this stuff with people and have the response be things like, man, like because of what I've learned in your screencast, I was able to get a raise. I was able to get a new job. I learned this skill set that I didn't have, and that helped me get here. And so there's a little bit of a give back to it, which I think is a lot of fun as well. And it's all just through the power of Twitter and the internet and free, doing stuff in the public space with sport data. That's it.
Wow. Okay. That was not what I was anticipating as your answer.
What did you anticipate it to be?
Oh, just claw and scratch and ask for internships here and there and just try and network. But so no,
asking for internships
Twitter
is a good one. That's a great way to connect with people. Here's the deal with asking for internships. And I'm pretty good. Like people email me, I try and take every phone call. Time permitting, I try and take every phone call or reply to every email because I know what it was like to be the young student and try and get involved. The best emails I get, if you're talking about trying to get an internship, the best emails I get aren't the ones that say, hey, do you have any internships? I'd love to talk to you. They're the ones that say, my name is Rocky and I just finished college and I'm really interested in being in pro football. I did this little analysis because I wanted to answer this question. Could you, read it over and maybe give me some feedback? That person will always get me on the phone because now I'm interested to hear about what you learned and how you would communicate it to our coach if he walked in the room and those kinds of things. Those are great ways to ask for internship, or to try and get on the radar for internships or jobs, is to come to the party with a side dish and say, hey, I did this. Like, what do you think? Yeah.
Oh, brilliant. I love it. Patrick, this has been fantastic. I didn't know where the conversation was going to lead, and I'm so happy it followed a path that was unexpected and really enjoyable and informative, obviously. So thank you so much for coming on, and thank you for giving me your time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It was great.
And that's a wrap for this episode of the Zealous Podcast. Patrick and I were talking, and turns out he's also going to be presenting at the NSCA National Conference this July between the 12th and the 15th in Las Vegas. So if you like the information he was sharing and you want to learn more, it's not a bad time to get your tickets all set and register for the conference. Just go to nsca.com. And until next week, make sure you follow us on Instagram at Rocky_Snyder. Click the subscribe button. Tell a few friends. Leave a comment while you're at it, and we'll see you next week.